Bans, moratoriums, and zoning. What are our strongest tools here? Next slide. Remember, there are so many ways to stop a data center. Zoning and land use vary extremely drastically by state and locality. We're going to go through some tips at the end of this presentation about how to know what will work for you. But if you can't explicitly or fully ban a data center, all hope is not lost. There are many other strategies available. Those are in policy, and some of them also involve organizing, campaigning, and legal strategies, which we'll talk about in our discussion. Next slide. But let's start with the most direct way to prohibit data centers, explicit bans. Across the country, you can use ordinances or ballot measures to explicitly prohibit construction of new data center facilities and prohibit expansion of existing data centers. This just happened in Monterey Park, the first city in California to fully ban data centers in city limits. Bans, however, can be complete or partial. You can prohibit data centers within certain zoning districts, for example, preventing data centers in residential areas or agricultural areas, like Prince William County in Virginia. You can ban facilities over a certain square footage, like Groton, Connecticut, or restrict them by resource use in terms of megawatts used. That's our recommendation. It's important to note that localities might not call this type of intervention a ban based on local politics and preemption concerns, but this can effectively block out hyperscale development, and it is one of our strongest tools. I want to also offer a cautionary note here that we are seeing some localities explore restricting data centers to only industrial zones. This can limit some harms, but does not fully mitigate the harmful impacts overall, particularly because industrial zones are often sited next to Black and brown neighborhoods or other marginalized communities that have already faced decades of environmental racism. So that's a critical consideration that we're seeing play out in the build-out across the country. Another note here and throughout, you may need legal support, especially if your state preempts or prevents your locality from banning certain types of development, including through exclusionary zoning. Next slide, please. Moratoriums. As we heard from Jenna, these are a key tool, and I like to talk about them as a practical, common sense pause on the build out to give a locality or a state time to update or issue regulations. These can turn into a ban, like Groton, Connecticut. Moratoriums are time-bound prohibitions on new data center approvals. They are not permanent, although as we will hear from Taylor, they can in some cases be extended. We recommend that a moratorium lasts for at least 6 months, but note that you will likely need longer, and we're seeing many that are now passed at a year. We are seeing moratoriums passed by local governments, such as Prince George's County and Big Rapids, Michigan, tribal nations, as we discussed in the previous session, and at least 12 states have filed data center moratorium bills. Maine was the first to pass this legislation, although the governor recently vetoed it. And I also want to highlight that utilities themselves can pass moratoriums on data center connections. This is not theoretical. This actually happened with AEP Ohio. Again, moratoriums, common sense pauses, and they need to be followed up with strong protections for them to have a lasting impact. Next slide. So what do you do if you can't explicitly ban a data center, or if you can't pass a moratorium, or maybe if you have a lot of power already and don't want to channel that towards a moratorium, but towards lasting protections? There are a few options here. Localities can build mechanisms into approval and zoning processes to reject data centers that don't meet their local standards or goals. To do this, you first need strong local goals that are set and passed by the local government. These can be around water use, energy, heat, economic development. There's many options here. And you can also use existing standards, such in the case of Phoenix, which has clean air goals that far exceed federal air quality standards. Once you have these goals, you then need to hold developers accountable and make sure that their proposals are responding to these standards and make them put the burden on them to prove how the project fits within these goals. We encourage independent review by experts with decision-making authority, not companies grading their own homework. So localities can require companies, for example, to fund pre-approval studies, but not to conduct them themselves. I want to note that this approach requires real enforcement power, which is something we are seeing lacking across the country. We are seeing in some cases fines of $1,000 a day. That means a lot to me, but not to an extremely wealthy corporation. So with these zoning amendments and with these ordinances, we need real enforcement power that includes meaningful, non-nominal fines and the power to reject applications. So how do we do that? Next slide, please. One way to approach this, although it is not the only way, and it might be called something different in your locality, is conditional use permits. Conditional use permits require developers to apply to the zoning board for permission to use their property in special ways. The approval is conditional. Developers have to meet certain requirements set by the local government in order to receive this approval. To do this, localities can amend zoning code or introduce new ordinances to create a separate conditional use permitting process for data centers. This requires defining data centers, setting a distinct class for data centers so they are not included in existing zoning regulations, not included in by right zoning, which often gives data centers automatic or easier approval. We encourage you, if this is your approach, to define data centers expansively. For example, not limiting them to AI use, since many data centers, the reported use is, for example, cloud computing, which is closely linked to AI. And we're dropping in one possible definition in the chat from our toolkit. I also want to note that this is a strategic choice. Localities can decide whether to define data centers as their own class or decenter data center language by passing ordinances that instead capture data centers within a broader industrial category, such as large load customers or high impact facilities. And this can be a helpful tool in states facing preemption concerns or where localities are unable to pass data center specific legislation by, again, defining them much more broadly by resource use. Conditional use permits can establish, like in Chandler, Arizona, that there is no permit unless it's explicitly approved. To me, that sounds like it should be obvious, but that is unfortunately the opposite of how some zoning situations work. And we need to make sure that conditional use permits include binding conditions attached to the approval process, such as, again, water and energy use plans, transparency, environmental impact assessments. And again, to note here that success of this, of this setup requires transparency both in pre-approval and then ongoing monitoring around water, energy, on-site emissions, the value of tax abatements, info on all the companies involved. There's a lot more there in the toolkit. A key part of transparency is robust public notice and community hearing requirements, ending the use of non-disclosure agreements and NDAs, and I'll shout out Tucson, Arizona and Pima County, and critically, the right for localities to reject applications that don't include this transparency and enforcement. We have a lot more details on this section in the toolkit. The link is in the chat, and we are available to answer questions. Next slide. I'm going to be very brief on this one just to highlight that if none of the above options work for you, localities can still take action by limiting where and how data centers are constructed. This can include setback requirements, which is a fancy way of saying the minimum distance between a data center and a residential area, a transit hub, agricultural districts, historic sites. You can also prohibit these types of zoning, agricultural, historic sites, wildlife, from being rezoned to instead be used for data center development. All of these are tools to throw friction into the process and make your locality less attractive for data center developers, particularly hyperscalers. Next slide. To wrap up and set us up for our panel, I want to preview an additional support resource that we will have coming soon that is kind of a how-to document of translating the recommendations that I just summarized to what will work in your locality, since every single jurisdiction is different. So three, overly simplified steps here. The first is to analyze your local conditions and zoning law to understand what is politically feasible in your jurisdiction. Do you have options for legislation? Are ballot measures allowed? Understand the local body that has authority to regulate data center development where you live. This is likely, embedded in zoning and land use authority, but in some cases, there are also what's called police powers in the legislative body that might apply to data center development. And it's important to know, does your local government have to consult a planning board around zoning law changes, or can it make changes unilaterally? Second is critically to check your state law for preemption issues to understand if your locality is allowed to pass exclusionary zoning, other types of zoning changes, local moratoriums, ballot measures, and to see if there are limits on the enforcement mechanisms that you can put in place. For example, some states will designate what a maximum fine could be. And the last point here is to understand existing local and state standards that you can then use to restrict data centers by defining your local goals. Generally, a locality's goals will have to meet or exceed a state's pre-existing goals. One note here is that data centers that already have approval or that have already submitted applications might not be subject to these new changes, but again, that is going to depend on the particulars of your situation.